بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وآله وصحبه أجمعين. We're in lesson 5. Again, that 5 is going to come up, and today we're going to do something to do with number 5 again. So what are the 5 conditions for Sahih Hadith? I love revising. What's the 5 conditions for Sahih Hadith? Uprightness of the narrator. You missed the first part of the lesson. Accuracy, uprightness, continuous chain of narration, not irregular, not anomalous. 5, give me 5. No, no, I don't go down that route. But what we're going to do is the universal principles of law. It's a very interesting story about this whole topic. We're talking about the 5 major principles of Islamic law, which summarized all the rulings of fiqh. There's this interesting story of Imam Tahir al-Dabbas, who's a blind scholar, and he used to love fiqh. Yeah, he used to love to study fiqh of prayer, fasting, zakat, commercial law, etc., etc. He knew all the details of law, but what he clicked on was something very interesting. He clicked onto the fact that there's something that links so many different specific rulings of fiqh that actually summarize the majority of the fiqh rulings that he had studied and taught. And what he used to do is he used to sit down and try and get a small number of these legal maxims as possible. He used to think and reflect over these rulings and think, okay, what's the common denominator in all these rulings? He used to sit after Isha, get the person in charge of the mosque to make sure nobody was in the mosque, close the doors, and he would sit in the mihrab, and out loud he would mention the things that the conclusions he'd come up with, his research. So imagine you're doing a PhD and you're writing up. You don't want anyone to know what your PhD is or what you're writing up, especially if other people are doing the same thing. So he used to make sure everyone was out to the mosque, and he used to sit there and try and ponder over these maxims. And what happened is another scholar heard somehow that he was working on this, and he didn't have the time to do the same thing, to spend 40 years reflecting, thinking. So he sneaked himself into the mosque, prayed Isha, and then hid at the back of the mosque where all the carpets are rolled up, all the old carpets, hid there, and the caretaker checked if anyone was in the mosque. No one's in the mosque. He left, locked the door, and the sheikh started to recite the maxims, these things that we're going to look at today. He started to go through them, and all of a sudden you hear a massive sneeze. Cough, sneeze, cough. And he's blind, but he goes up to and then he knows where the sound's coming from. He starts to go for it. But the important thing is, that instance is mentioned in many, many hadith, and it's mentioned that this person traveled from Herat all the way to Imam Tahir and tried to understand and steal some of his knowledge. What he stole was 5 maxims. Part of what he stole was 5 maxims. And these are actually things that encompass all of the fiqh that you will study. That's the claim of scholars. It actually summarizes all the fiqh, prayer, fasting, purification, zakat, commercial law, marriage law. It'll actually summarize all that into 5 sayings. And Qawa'id is what we're talking about. Maxims, Qawa'id are basically general rules. What are they? A general rule which applies to a large number of its related particulars. Now, this is a general rule which applies to a large number of its related particulars. Now, basically what it is, it's a saying which is a general statement under which you have so many specific rulings. And it'll become very, very clear what that means as we go through the lesson. You'll have a general statement. Then underneath that, you'll have something to do with prayer, something to do with fasting, something to do with zakat, etc., etc., which aids in understanding those rulings. So it's a basic statement. And if I give you an example, I want you to give me examples of specific issues of fiqh that are related to this. Now, this is one of these general maxims. Acts are judged by the intent behind them. Al-amur bimaqasidiha. One of the things that Sheikh was sitting and reciting again and again was al-amur bimaqasidiha. That's one of the things, the short statements that he had, which underneath it has so many different applications in Islamic law. Now, if you do something, this maxim will actually relate to it in some way or another. But think of it, how would it relate to something you do? We're actually going to come to this in a specific example, but think of it. An example, give me an example of that. If your prayer is obligatory or non-obligatory, okay. So basically your intention. You're talking about the importance of intention. Okay, we talked about the punishment being taken away in a situation of famine. As an example, al-umur bi-maqasidiha. That would be interesting because the person who's thieving, why is he thieving? Is that important? That's actually a very good example. I think that would actually work and hold true. Because that's a specific situation where Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu created a moratorium on the application of the law of had because he felt that people shouldn't be taken into account for things that were outside their control. They didn't intend to take somebody's private property. They intended to save themselves from famine and death, for example. In fact, that instance relates to a number of these maxims that we look at. But the important thing is, it relates to so many of these different things. It's one statement which relates to so many different issues of law. Now, this is a prophetic hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, whatever intoxicates in large amounts is haram in small amounts. ما أسكر كثيره فقليله حرام. What is the Prophet ﷺ talking about there? Whatever intoxicates in large amounts, then a small amount of that is haram. Now that's a general statement, isn't it? And underneath that is what? How many issues can you think of? That includes wine, it includes... Think of all the things that come to your mind. He's not saying this is haram, that's haram, that's haram, if it's a lot, if it's a little. He's mentioning a general statement which answers so many different questions. It's one of these qualities the Prophet had of saying a general statement and underneath it would be such wisdom. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, he discussed this in his fatwa. He discussed this specific hadith. And he says the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam, through the gift of succinct speech, jawami al-kalim. Now it's a gift. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the Prophet many, many special gifts. One of which was the ability to say something in a short statement which contained and was pregnant with a number of meanings. And here specifically, it summarizes in this short hadith all things that cloud the intellect and intoxicate. Summarizes, that's an important thing, because we're talking about Qawa'id is summarizing something or many, many things into one statement. Not differentiating between one type and another, wine, whiskey, doesn't matter. Whatever intoxicates in large amounts, then in small amounts it's haram. Showing it to be of no relevance whether the intoxicant is an edible form or liquid form. That's interesting as well. It's not just specific to liquor. It actually extends to things that cloud the intellect in terms of drugs. Even though there's difference in terms of rulings. In this situation, in terms of najasa, for example, but here specifically, that one statement covers so many different scenarios. And that happens through what? Through the Prophet ﷺ had been given this quality of jawami al-kalim. And that's one of the ways the Prophet used to teach. He used to say a very general statement and people used to ask, what do you mean? And then he would explain it. So there's a very interesting hadith of Abu Qatada ibn Rabi' radiyallahu anhu, and he said that there was a janazah, a funeral procession going past, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, mustarihun wa mustarihun minhu wa mustarahun minhu. This is a person who either he's been given ease, or other people are being given ease in place of him. The general meaning of the hadith. And that was a general statement. What does it mean to be given ease or other people being given ease from you? And when they asked the Prophet ﷺ, he said that if he's a good person and a pious person, then he's being given ease from the earth and the world and all that it contains in terms of hardship. And he's going to the mercy of God. And if he's a person who's wicked and evil, then people, the land, the trees and animals are being given respite from his evil. So in other words, that hadith had a very general statement, and then it made them understand that it actually relates to a number of different things. He was good to so many different people, and he was evil. If he was evil, then he was evil to so many different people. You didn't have to mention that he did this, he did that, he did this. It's a very interesting method that Prophet used to do. In fact, the scholars used to use that as well, that method of teaching. It's one of the specific methods of teaching. And in fact, Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala used the very same thing. He was sitting, and somebody came to him and described a situation in which a woman is in a non-Muslim country, has no guardian, and wants to get married. And according to Imam Shafi'i, a woman to get married needs the permission, the express permission of a guardian. We'll cover that in the marriage module. Now, when he's asked that, what was he thinking? What goes through his mind? A woman in a non-Muslim country wants to get married. According to him, she can't. Why? She doesn't have a guardian, yeah? So then she can't get married. What did he answer? He didn't say she can get married or she can't get married, or if she does this, then she can. He said, Al-amru idha daqat tasa'. A situation or a scenario when it becomes difficult, then facility is made. What do you mean? Does that make any sense to you? Just give me a yes and no answer. What's this, kind of... Do you understand what I said? Did you understand that answer? And then somebody else comes to Imam Shafi'i and starts talking about, utensils and pots and pans that have got najasa in them, but the problem is that in the country that he's in, that's all they use to serve food and to carry food or carry water. And Imam Shafi'i was asked for an answer. He didn't say, do this or go there and buy this. He says, Al-amru idha daqat tasa'. A situation when it becomes difficult, facility is made. Is that a yes or no answer? Another person, what? It's a rhetorical question. Another person comes and says, this is the best one. This is, if you lived in the Middle East or Pakistan, this would be a good one. You know these flies that fly about? It's really nice and romantic. But sometimes they fall on poo and they get up. You get what I'm saying? So basically they've got najasa on their how many feet do flies have? 6. Who said 4? Yeah. They're not flying cows. But the interesting thing, the person said, the fly's going to come and sit on my clothes when I'm praying. Surely I can't pray. You obviously know the answer to that, don't you? Okay. But his answer was what? Not that, you should live somewhere where there's no flies or get some fly spray or something. He said, Al-amru idha daqat tasa'. He said, when a matter becomes constricted, facilitation is made. All those answers were the same answer. That one answer answers 100,000 questions. That's an exaggeration. But basically, you can answer that in any situation. If your wife asks you, why are you not eating my food? And I'll just say, when a matter becomes constricted, facilitation is made. It's a wrong answer. Now, I said there's 5, so you need to know 5 legal maxims. And this is, there's books written on this topic, but what they always focus on these 5 maxims. They're so important that in poems, they put them in poem form. Yeah? In other words, you memorize them, and then when you're studying fiqh, you always try and revise these specific issues. All of fiqh is built upon the removal of harm, and there's 5. Yeah? There's 5 specific rulings that we're going to look at today, which are important. You need to know them like the back of your hand. Again, that comes up again and again in this course. You need to know this is like the back of your hand. Well, but what they say is قَدْ أُسِّسَ الْفِقْهُ عَلَى رَفْعِ الضَّرَرِ. That fiqh is established upon the removal of harm. قَدْ أُسِّسَ الْفِقْهُ عَلَى رَفْعِ الضَّرَرِ وَأَنَّمَا يُشَّقُّ يَجْلِبُ الْوَطَرِ وَنَفْيُ رَفْعِ الْقَطْعِ بِشَكِّ وَأَنْ يُحَكِّمُ الْعُرْفَ وَزَادَ مَنْفَطًا كون الأمور تبع المقاصد مع التكلف ببعد وارد. That is in your notes. Okay? It contains, in 3 lines, it contains the 5 principles of Islamic law. Everything we're going to look at is 5. And the most important, in fact, the one that relates to the reason why the law exists, relates to the wisdom of Islamic law, is this one. Harm must be alleviated. Ad-darar yuzal. If there's harm, it needs to be alleviated. Now that saying relates to how many specific rulings of Islamic law? Think of it in your mind. Just think of that, what it means. Harm must be alleviated. And think of a specific instance that applies to. Just think of that in your mind. Harm, and where Islamic law would want that harm to be alleviated. How many things have you come up with? Give me a specific example in fiqh where that applies. That's a classic. I mean, I have no idea what that means, temporarily getting married. Okay, we'll come back to you. You just fall asleep for a minute. We'll come back to you. Anyone else? Anyone else? See, he had an amazing answer last week about something about the door, remember? I just remember that. Something about the door, and I even remember the question. It was so deep. Anyone else? Eating non-halal food, if it means you won't starve. That's good, because where's the harm? The harm is that you might starve. And that needs to be removed, regardless of what you do to remove it. That's a good point. And we're actually going to come to another very interesting maxim related to that. Now this is placed at number 1, and I've specifically put it at number 1 because it relates to the higher purposes of the law. The law is there for the protection of 5 things, which we're going to look at next week. But basically, Ibn al-Najjar, he says that this is a maxim that has its origins in the attainment of the higher purposes of the law. And they're very, very, very pivotal. Protection of life, protection of honor, lineage, religion, property. All those things have to be protected, not just in Islamic law, but in all laws. Okay, and this specific maxim actually relates and strengthens those 5. And it's done by what? Either repulsing harmful matters or alleviating them. In other words, something's harmful for those 5 things specifically. It's either removed or it's put aside or alleviated or suspended, etc., etc. Now that example you mentioned about the had punishment for theft is a perfect example of this as well. So you can see there's many, many specific rulings of fiqh that relate to this as well. And a very interesting example is this. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ihtakara fahuwa khati'un." Whoever hoards has committed wrong. Now, did we cover this hadith before at some point? Yeah. What was the context of this hadith before? Because this hadith is going to come up again 2 or 3 times in the course for different reasons. What was the reason that I mentioned it before? Yeah, taking something that should be that's for other people to use, beneficial for other people. That's close. That is almost it, actually. Anyone else? Public interest. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Public good. Basically, this hadith was instituted for public good. And this is why this specific hadith is interesting, because the person who relates it from the Prophet ﷺ, Ma'mar ibn Abdullah, he's a close companion of the Prophet ﷺ, one of the first people that traveled to Habasha. He came back to Mecca al-Mukarramah, stayed, and didn't perform the emigration to Medina until quite late on. He was the person that actually shaved the hair of the Prophet ﷺ in the farewell pilgrimage. He's well known for that. Very close companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Now he relates this hadith. Okay, that's the chain, isn't it? And then the person who relates it from him is Sa'id ibn Musayyib, one of his main students. One of the main people that takes from Ma'mar ibn Abdullah is Sa'id ibn Musayyib. Now somebody said to Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Ibrahim ibn Muhammad, who's a relator on the next part of the chain, he said to Sa'id, when he related this hadith, he said, "But you hoard." Did I mention this in the last lesson? He said, "You hoard." The Prophet is saying, whoever hoards has committed wrong. And Sa'id ibn Musayyib, who is one of the 7 great scholars of Madinah al-Munawwara, basically the most knowledgeable person after the companions, almost by consensus. What did he do? He used to hoard. Where's the problem? The Prophet said, whoever hoards has committed wrong. What did he say in response? He says, Ma'mar ibn Abdullah, who heard it from the Prophet ﷺ, used to hoard. We've got a problem, haven't we? Where's the problem? Most pious people hoard. That's excellent. I told you to be quiet. We've already created a lot of problems with your temporary marriage issue. So where's the problem? Where's the problem here? Should you not just act upon the hadith? Should you not just do what the Prophet said and not hoard? Basically, Imam Mazari, when he discussed this, he said, it shows that the hadith doesn't just mean you shouldn't hoard. It means you shouldn't create harm. And if you hoard and it doesn't create harm, there's no problem in hoarding. In other words, if you go to the local wholesale and buy 4 sacks of rice, if you're from a certain part of the world, you buy rice, and in a certain part, you buy wheat. If you're North Pakistan, I think you buy wheat, isn't it? So I was speaking to somebody about medicine, herbal medicine. They said, which part of Pakistan are you from? And depending on that, he'll give me a cure. Because apparently a certain part of Pakistan eats wheat, and a certain part eats rice. Hot, cold, balanced, something like that. The important thing is, this hadith is related to harm. It's not related to hoarding. If hoarding leads to harm, it's haram. If it doesn't, it's not. In other words, Ma'mar ibn Abdullah understood the hadith. Sa'id ibn Musayyib, who was a student, understood the hadith. We don't understand the hadith if we don't have the context to it. So that's important. That specific maxim is very important, but underneath it has a number of different related maxims. Necessity is measured in accordance with its true proportions. In other words, even when applying that, for example, the example given was of somebody who's dying of hunger, starvation, and they need to eat something that's haram. Okay, but you only eat enough to remain alive, okay? You don't kind of get your, sit down and get your knife and fork out and really kind of put the candles on and stuff like that. You actually do it in a proportion. And that's law. That's how law works. You actually take consideration for the rules and boundaries of law itself. And also related to that is prevention of harm takes priority over the attraction of benefit. These are kind of related things. That statement will have underneath it many, many things. In other words, it's more important to stay alive, that example, than to not eat something that's haram. Obviously, you don't eat something that's haram for a specific reason. There's a benefit in not eating not eating swine, for example. It's a health benefit. But if there's that on one hand, and on the other hand, you're remaining alive, which one do you give preference to? So you can see related to it are a number of specific rules as well that help us understand it. So that's the first. The most important is al-darar yuzal, that harm is alleviated. It's applied again and again in Islamic law. The second, so this is the second of the 5, is al-mushaqqa tajlibu al-taysir. Difficulty. If difficulty exists, what happens is the Shari'ah says, okay, let's make things easy for people. Yeah? Mushaqqa brings with it ease. If there's any kind of difficulty, you find ease. And this is interesting. Look at these examples. The permissibility of tayammum, using dust, where the use of water would lead to difficulty. Sitting during the course of the prayer, where standing would entail hardship. Shortening the prayer during a journey, where praying it fully would entail hardship, etc., etc. You can see that mushaqqa, which is difficulty, when it exists, in certain situations the law facilitates things. Very similar to the words of Imam Shafi'i, which we talked about. Yeah? Al-amru idha daqat tisa'. If something becomes difficult, ease is made. It's almost the same. This is actually related to that. But also related to this is things that we all know about. Like, for example, somebody passes away, okay? And they're washed, and they're going to be prayed upon. Now, what's the ruling? We haven't covered this, but people will know the ruling for going and praying the janazah prayer, the funeral prayer for that person. Does everybody have to do it? So nobody has to do it. The majority have to do it? What if nobody does it? Everyone says we're all busy and we'll do it tomorrow. Huh? Everybody's sinful because it's an obligation. But not on everybody, because if it's an obligation on everybody, that would be difficult. That would be mushaqqa. That would be hardship. Yeah, that hardship means that the law has said, okay, if some people do it, that'll be enough. If 3 people do it, 2 people do it. If they do it, that's the most important thing. In fact, all communal obligations, all furud al-kifaya, everything that you hear about as being a communal obligation is of this type. That the law says as long as some people do it, it's sufficient. For example, studying law, Islamic law. It's an obligation, but certain people have to do it. Medicine is the same. Engineering is the same. Some people have to do it. It's an obligation. And if nobody does it, then everybody's sinning. You understand? Why is everybody not told to do it? Because everybody doesn't, nobody likes engineering. Because I was in Glasgow University. All the really depressed students were, I'm sorry if you're studying engineering, but this is true. All the depressed students were engineering students. But it's a communal obligation, so you need to do it. Who's doing engineering here? No one's going to admit it now. There you go. Sorry. So you just dropped. Okay. Related to this is necessity makes unlawful lawful. Meaning that if there's a necessity for something, it makes something that's unlawful lawful. That's straightforward. We've gone through an example of that as well. So that's 2. Number 3 is simple, straightforward. Certainty is not overruled by doubt. Al-yaqeen la yazul bil-shak. You've got certainty in something, that will never be overcome. You will stick to your certainty. The best example of that is probably the prayer when you forget whether you've still got wudu or not, and you're sure you did wudu. And you're about to pray and you think, oh, you kind of, something stops you. So what's the issue there? You've got certainty in what? That you've done wudu. And you're doubtful over whether you broke your wudu. What do? You just go up there. Just do that. If you're Hanafi, go right up there like this. That's important because that specific ruling, we'll look at this again. Next lesson in prayer, that is used again and again. There's an example here, it's in your notes, very straightforward. Kalthum intends to fast and has a doubt over whether she continued eating after daybreak arrived. In other words, there's not much time to eat. You know, in Ramadan in Glasgow, there's not much time. So people eat and eat and eat, and then Fajr's about to start. She's not sure if Fajr started, but she's still eating. Or her husband's still eating. Now, what's the situation in terms of law? That maxim says what? Certainty is not removed by doubt. What are you certain about here? You're certain that you started eating when you were allowed to eat. You're doubtful whether you continued eating when you're not permitted to eat. What do you do? Huh? Your fast is okay. You don't have to say, oh, my fast is broken, etc., etc. There's so many different actual situations where that's used. But there's also related maxims as well, yes?
Just wondering, should the person check, if they've the ability to check, should they check if they've actually stopped eating that time?
The thing about checking is related to time. And the issue about time is there's a whole leeway between what specific, in terms of the times that we use, in terms of minutes, of what time you should actually stop and not stop. So here, basically, you go with your certainty. And if there's a doubt in that, if you're certain if it's like 20 minutes, that's obviously broken your fast because you're certain at that point. Because why? Because then it's not this specific qa'idah. It's not this maxim, it's something else. You've got certainty and then you've got certainty. Certainty is removed by certainty. It's obvious. But not by doubt. See, the moment it becomes certainty, we're not in this territory at all. It's very straightforward then. Okay? Now, related to that is a number of very interesting things. The norm is that of lack of liability. The basic ruling is that of you not being liable to do something. Somebody says to you, have you prayed have you prayed the prayer of repentance, for example? And you say, what's that? And you say, oh, that's a prayer you have to pray every day between Maghrib and Isha. And you say to the person, well, where'd you get this from? Your pocket. Where'd you get this from? I'm not liable to do anything except the 5 prayers. And that's all I've been told. And until I find out otherwise, there's nothing called that prayer at all. That's called this issue of the norm being the lack of liability. Liability to pray, for example. Somebody comes up to you and says, here's my tenner. You say, what tenner? He says, the tenner I gave you. You say, prove it to me. Why? Because the norm is a lack of liability. You don't owe anybody something. You don't need to pray extra prayers. You don't do anything until it's proven otherwise. That's all based upon this thing of certainty is not overruled by doubt. Related to that also is this idea that people are innocent until proven guilty. At one point, this rule was used a lot. People are innocent until proven guilty based on what? Certainty is not overruled by doubt. Everybody is basically born innocent. Yeah? And you don't prove otherwise until you have proof on that. There's many, many other maxims related to this. The norm with regards to things is that permissibility. In other words, somebody comes up to you with some strange concoction of food. And they're a Muslim, they say, try some of this. And you say, what is it? And they say, I got it from my garden. And you look at it and it's moving. And then he beats it. If he beats it, it's dead, you can't eat it. Okay? But if it's a fruit, then the origin is that it's permissible. Anything you find, anything you see, it's permissible for you to eat it, wear it. Okay? Drink it. Until proven otherwise. If you drink it and you kind of start getting dizzy, that's a good sign that it's haram. Because it's a good sign it's haram, meaning it changes this, which is certainty is not overruled by doubt, to certainty is removed by certainty. Because you're certain you're not certain when you're intoxicated that you're intoxicated, but you will find out that you're intoxicated. So that'll be certainty is removed by certainty. So you understand how these rules work? They're basically general rules that tell you whether you can do certain things or not do certain things. And these are very good as we'll come to in a minute, rules of thumb, first aid, where you don't know the answer, but you need to make a guess very quickly, and you don't have recourse to a scholar, for example. They're very, very good for you to have a good idea what's permitted, what's not. Also, number 4, this is number 4, and this is in fact something we've done before. Custom, we've actually covered this. Al-'ada muhakkama, that the custom is given the weight of the law. And we've covered this hadith a number of times now. The hadith of the wife of Abu Sufyan, Hind radiyallahu anha. She comes to the Prophet ﷺ and complains about Abu Sufyan and says he's a man who's miserly. What does he say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He says, take whatever suffices you and your child and whatever is the customary method. Bil ma'ruf. Khudi ma yakfiki wa walidiki bil ma'ruf. Take whatever suffices you and your child in what is customary. And we cover this hadith where? We covered this at least 2 times the last couple of weeks, if you remember. Where did we cover this hadith? We covered it in custom, legal custom. But why is this different from this? And this I'm going to ask somebody to explain why this is different from this. Last week we covered something called local custom as one of the sources of Islamic law. Yeah? As well as blocking the means to harm. Yeah? And now we're covering this as one of the legal maxims. So this same hadith is in a chapter which talks about the sources of Islamic law last week. Where else did we cover it? Scratch your heads. So I know you're... Huh? Sunnah. Yeah, we covered it in the Sunnah chapter. The second source of Islamic law is the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Quran is the first. And why did we cover it in the Sunnah section? Yes, excellent. Imam Qarrafi discusses the Prophet ﷺ and the way he used to rule. And he talks about a situation where the Prophet, it's differed upon whether he acted as a judge or as a mufti. And this hadith is the example he gives. Did the Prophet speak with these words, alayhi salatu wasalam, as a judge or a mufti? In other words, did he have the defendant and the plaintiff in front of him, the 2 parties in front of him, in which case it would be a judgment as a judge? Or did he just give the ruling to Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, in which case it would be a fatwa? He discussed it there as well. So we looked at it in that context. Last week we looked at it in the context of a source of Islamic law something that's used to create laws. In other words, you want to know the ruling, therefore you use this to create a law. Now we're looking at it as what? As a general rule which summarizes many, many rules that the Islamic legal code has codified for us, answers that we already have, but this is a very good summary of all those different issues in Islamic law. So it's slightly different because, think of it, you've got sources of Islamic law, the Quran, the Sunnah, Qiyas. Those are used to do what? To produce and give you answers. Yeah? So if you want to know what the ruling on drinking wine is, the Quran's very clear, it gives you a ruling. Okay? That's what the sources do. They give you rulings, and they give you how many rulings? Depending on how many issues you have, you get different rulings. Because you've got all these sources. And at the end of the process, you have these 5 legal maxims, because these summarize all the rulings. Okay? So that's very, very important in terms of how legal rulings are arrived at. They're arrived at the end of the process. This is why Imam Tahir, he sat in his mosque revising what? He was looking at all the rulings that he had in terms of fiqh, all the thousands and thousands of things, trying to summarize them into smaller sections and smaller statements. And he came up with how many? About 17, 18. And they were summarized into 5. They're summarizing all those legal rulings that we actually know to be part of the Islamic legal code. And that, again, has many, many ramifications. You go and you buy a flat, for example. Now you buy and you pay for it. And you go into the flat and you find there's no cooker. There's no washing machine. There's no curtains. There's no carpets. And when you went in, you thought that the carpets, the curtains were included. And then you go to your lawyer and say, well, this is the situation. I thought that these were included. And he'll basically tell you, is it customary for people to leave carpets, curtains, all these goods or not? In Islamic law, if it's customary, then you basically didn't just buy the flat, you bought all the things that were with it. If it's customary to sell them like that. And if it's not, then you haven't. So this is why the law, in terms of custom, is very, very important. Custom, al-'ada muhakkama, as they say. And again, related to this are a number of related maxims. What is determined by custom is tantamount to a contractual stipulation. If something is customary, then it's as if it's a condition. Like that example I gave of a flat. When you bought it, if it was customary to leave curtains and carpets in the flat, then it's almost as if it's a stipulation and a shart, condition for the sale. In other words, if you don't give me that, then I'm not buying it. So that's where urf, custom, comes in to its own as well, where it's related to something that is stipulated, not specifically written down, but it's understood to be part of that. And the last of the 5, so we've covered ad-darar yuzal, that harm is alleviated, al-mushaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, that hardship begets ease. We've covered, what else, what other 2? Custom, al-'ada muhakkama, number 3. Certainty and doubt. Can you see those 4? Certainty is not removed by doubt. Number 5 is what? Related to intention, which is the one we started with. Acts are judged by their purpose. Al-amur bimaqasidiha. Why? Because when you worship, you stand up to pray dhuhr, for example. You're standing up to pray dhuhr. Why? Because you've intended that. The moment you say, I'm standing up to pray dhuhr, your intention is to pray dhuhr. How do you differentiate between dhuhr and asr? Your intention. How do you differentiate between fasting for Ramadan and not for Ramadan? But the fact that you're in Ramadan, in fact, that's an interesting one because your intention is overridden by the fact that you're living in Ramadan, according to the Hanafi school. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم. God does not take you to task on account of inadvertent statements in your oaths, but will take you to account for the intentions that your hearts have made. The issue of your intention, your intent, your niyyah, all these words are important. Now this is probably the most important, and this is interesting because people think, okay, I understand it works in fasting, praying, worship, Hajj, for example, all these things, but how does it work in terms of business, for example? How does it work in terms of marriage? Does it make any difference what your intention is? Surely you should just judge by the person and what he does. Like somebody comes up to you and just takes money out of your pocket. What's that classified as? And the person doesn't know you? Theft. But he goes to the court and he says, but my intention was that there was a person who's begging outside, and I wanted to take his money and give it to that person. So my intention was actually really, really, really good. And it's Christmas. It's almost Christmas. So I felt that I would be someone who's going to help poor people. And what's the judge going to say? Well, obviously, the al-amur bi maqasidiha, acts are judged by their purpose. His purpose was good. So we just let them all off then. Now it's interesting, this is an example of how it works in terms of not just religious law in terms of worship, but also in terms of commercial law. Ahmed's walking about Sucky Hall Street, finds a Cartier watch, and he looks around and he picks it up, puts it in his pocket, and he walks fast. He does a U-turn, goes into the subway, comes back out trying to dodge all the cameras, and he realizes his camera's watching, etc., etc. But he tries to dodge, and he gets home. He gets home, and his daughter takes the watch and puts it in a cup of water, a cup of tea. And it's not waterproof, and it's damaged. In other words, it's written off. End of story, isn't it? Okay. That watch has got a sat-nav tracking device, something, and there's some born identity guy chasing this guy up, and he's tracked it up. You can do it with the iPhone. An example of the iPhone would be perfect. Finds an iPhone, goes home, gets damaged, and the guy finds it. And I've actually watched a YouTube video of somebody tracking. Did you watch this? It's actually really funny. They track their iPhone and they get to the guy's house and bring the police. They don't beat him up. It was in America, so they don't do that kind of stuff there. But the interesting thing is, Ahmed, when he picked it up, what did he intend to do? Does that make any difference? Does it make any difference? It does. In Islamic law, it does. If he picked it up, and his intention in the eyes of God was to take it home and then go directly to the police station and say, I found this. If anyone wants to claim it, they can claim it, etc., etc. And all that happened is he went home on the way, it got damaged. In Islamic law, he doesn't have to pay for anything. There's no liability on that person because it's amana. Amana is basically he takes it, he's preserving it to safeguard the person's right over that. And in the process, it gets damaged. It's not his fault. But if he took it and he goes, yes, man, it's Christmas again, Ahmed. The moment he says that, he's taking it as ghasb. Ghasb is to usurp. It's basically not to steal because there's no kind of hirs, there's no boundary. He's not stealing it from somebody, he's just picking it up. If that's the case and it gets tracked, he's going to have to pay for that because he caused it to get damaged. So depending on his intention, in law, if he denies that that was his intention, then all he has to do is swear an oath that it wasn't, and he's let off in Islamic law. But if he doesn't want to swear a false oath, then he's going to go down or get a fine, whatever happens to people like that. The important thing is intention doesn't just matter in issues of worship. It actually is important in terms of issues like this as well. Now, related to this are many, many maxims. Related to intent, for example, it is the intent and meaning behind contracts that is given credence, not the outward form and wording. For example, you go into a shop and say, can I get that? And you say, yeah, take that. And you go, here you are. You didn't say, can I buy this from you? Yes, here's the money for it. Let's shake on that, etc. It's not like a formal contract. The important thing is, in certain schools of Islamic law, you have to say, can I buy this from you? Can you sell this to me? You have to have a very strict method of actually explaining that you're buying things. But the majority of scholars say the most important thing is the intent. You're going in, you throw the money down, you pick it up, and you go. No one says, can I take this for this much? There's no kind of discussion. You just say, okay, end of story. So that's an important actual application of it. But the issue that I mentioned at the beginning was important. Outward proofs take the place of intentions in cases where the intention cannot otherwise be ascertained. That is the kind of the golden rule of this, the application of this specific maxim. If it's pretty obvious why somebody's doing something, then you don't even have to go down the route of saying why you're doing it. For example, Ahmed's there, and he puts a balaclava on, and he picks up the iPhone, puts it in his pocket, and he goes home, and it gets destroyed, and he goes to the court, and he says, I was just holding it as amana. I was just actually trying to secure it, to give it back to you. And the judge goes, what's a balaclava for? And he goes, it's cold. So why did you realize it's cold just when you're about to pick the iPhone up? So in that kind of situation, outward proofs do not take, they actually take, they hold their own, and they do not overridden by this issue of intention at all. Now these 5, if you remember the 5, and you look at all the things that you've studied, you'll find that they summarize fiqh. That's the most important thing. But the second most important thing is they're very, very practical. They're actually things that you can use, as I said before, rules of thumb, first aid. They give you a very, very good idea of what Islamic law would say in the majority of situations. The reason why they don't say in all situations is because there's something called exceptions. And there's more exceptions. The funny thing is there's more exceptions to these rules than there are rules. So when I said at the beginning that these 5 will get you through, studying for 20 years or whatever, it's not really the truth. But they do summarize many, many rules of Islamic law. And this is why they say that at the end of that poem, مَعَ التَّكَلُّفٍ بِبَعْدٍ وَارِدِ, they say that even though they say that all of the Sharia laws are encapsulated in these 5, that's not the case, because there's a lot of issues that are not related to these at all. And you'll know that when you study fiqh.